"You're coming with me." The voice was low and steady, cutting through the howl of the wind like tempered steel. Aaliyah flinched, pulling the thin collar of her coat tighter around her neck. She didn't look up. In this part of Tokyo, after midnight, with snow beginning to stick to the frozen pavement, looking up was an invitation for trouble she couldn't afford. The bus was 40 minutes late. Each gust of wind felt like a physical blow, stealing the last dregs of warmth from her bones. She was wearing her dark green nursing scrubs under the coat, a constant reminder of the first of her 2 jobs. The 12-hour hospital shift had bled directly into an 8-hour waitressing shift at a small American-style diner, and the exhaustion was so profound it felt like a sickness. Her feet were numb, her fingers clumsy with cold. The man had spoken from the obsidian silence of a black car that had pulled up to the curb so quietly she hadn't even heard it. It was long and immaculate, a predator resting in the urban snowscape. She kept her eyes fixed on the murky reflection in the bus shelter's plexiglass. "No, thank you," she managed, her voice thin and brittle. The car door opened. The sound was a soft, expensive thud. A wave of warmth, scented with leather and something clean like cold rain, washed over her. He was tall, his presence a solid wall against the biting wind. He wore a dark, perfectly tailored overcoat that probably cost more than her rent for an entire year. His face was sharp angles and shadows under the weak street lamp, his dark hair untouched by the snow. He looked directly at her, his gaze intense and unnervingly calm. That was not a request. There was no malice in his tone, just an unnerving certainty, a quiet command that brooked no argument. This was a man accustomed to being obeyed. She finally met his eyes, a spark of defiance flickering in her exhausted spirit. "I don't know you." A faint, almost imperceptible softening happened at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't a smile. It was something more complex, something that acknowledged her bravery and dismissed it in the same breath. "My name is Kenji, and you are freezing to death waiting for a bus that will not come. The lines are shut down due to the storm." Her heart sank. Of course, they were. She had no money for a cab, and her apartment was a 45-minute walk away, an impossible distance in this weather. A shiver racked her body, so violent it was humiliating. Kenji's gaze didn't waver. "Get in the car, Aaliyah." He knew her name. The flicker of defiance died, replaced by a cold nod of fear. How did he know her name? She worked at the diner, serving coffee and burgers to strangers. Had she served him? She couldn't remember. The cold was making it hard to think, sanding the edges off her awareness. He simply stood there, holding the door open, the warm interior of the car a silent, powerful argument. The wind sliced at her again, and she saw her own tired, desperate reflection in the car's polished surface. The choice wasn't a choice at all. It was survival. With a deep, shuddering breath that felt like swallowing ice, she moved past him and slid onto the soft leather seat. The door closed, sealing them in a world of profound silence and warmth, shutting out the storm completely. The drive was silent. The city slid past the tinted windows, a blur of neon and falling snow, muted and distant. Aaliyah sat perfectly still, her hands clenched in her lap, her mind racing. She tried to place his face, to recall a customer from the diner with those watchful, intelligent eyes, but came up empty. He didn't look at her. He simply stared ahead, his profile stark and unreadable. They didn't drive toward her neighborhood of cramped, aging apartment blocks. Instead, the car moved into the heart of the city, toward the gleaming towers that scraped the sky. The fear she'd felt at the bus stop began to curdle into a more specific, more terrifying dread. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but the doors were locked, and the man beside her radiated a placid authority that felt as unbreakable as the bulletproof glass she imagined surrounded them. The car descended into a private underground garage, and a moment later, they were ascending in a silent, high-speed elevator. The ride was so smooth she felt it only as a slight pressure in her ears. The doors opened directly into a sprawling penthouse apartment. The space was vast and minimalist, a study in quiet luxury. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a panoramic view of the snow-swept city below. The furniture was sparse and elegant, dark wood, gray fabrics, clean lines. There was no clutter, no personal mess, only an air of sterile, controlled perfection. It was less a home and more a monument to wealth and solitude. Kenji shrugged off his overcoat, revealing a crisp white shirt and dark trousers. He didn't look at her as he spoke, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous room. There is a guest room down the hall. The bathroom is attached. You'll find clothes in the closet. Take a shower. Warm up. He gestured vaguely to his left before walking toward the kitchen area, his movements economical and precise. Aaliyah didn't move. She felt small and out of place, her damp, cheap coat and worn scrubs an insult to the pristine environment. "Why am I here?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He paused, his back to her. "Because you were cold." He opened a refrigerator that hummed silently and retrieved a bottle of water. "And I decided you wouldn't be." It was the simplest of answers, yet it explained nothing. It felt like a deflection, a truth that concealed a dozen others. She found the guest room. It was larger than her entire apartment, dominated by a low-slung bed with a mountain of white pillows. In the walk-in closet, just as he'd said, were clothes. Not extravagant gowns, but simple, soft things. A gray cashmere sweater, black lounge pants, thick wool socks. Everything was new, the tag still attached. In the bathroom, the shower was a glass-enclosed space with a dozen nozzles. The heat was instantaneous and enveloping. As the scalding water sluiced the chill from her skin, she let her head fall against the cool marble tiles. The exhaustion of the past 48 hours crashed over her, a wave that threatened to pull her under. She wasn't just tired, she was worn down to the very fiber of her being. When she emerged, wrapped in a towel thicker than any she had ever owned, she found a tray on the bed. It held a bowl of steaming rice porridge, garnished with scallions and ginger, and a cup of fragrant green tea. He was nowhere to be seen. She ate, the warmth spreading through her, a comforting weight in her stomach. The fear hadn't vanished, but it was being crowded out by a profound, irresistible fatigue. She climbed into the bed, the sheets cool and crisp against her skin. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she was warm, she was clean, and she was not hungry. As she drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep, her last coherent thought was that safety that felt this precarious was the most dangerous thing of all. She awoke to the pale, gray light of a snow-bright morning. For a moment, she was disoriented, the unfamiliar ceiling and the heavy silence confusing her. Then the memory of the previous night rushed back, the freezing bus stop, the black car, the imposing stranger named Kenji. She sat up, her heart pounding a steady, anxious rhythm. The apartment was utterly still. The tray from last night was gone. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet sinking into a thick wool rug. The clothes he'd provided were impossibly soft against her skin. Hesitantly, she crept out of the guest room and into the main living area. The view was even more staggering in the daylight. The city was blanketed in a thick, pristine layer of white, the snow muffling the usual urban roar into a gentle hum. Kenji was gone, but on the polished black stone of the kitchen island, a simple breakfast was laid out, a small pot of coffee, a bowl of fresh fruit, and a piece of toast on a plain white plate. Next to it was a single white card, on which was written a single word in neat, precise script. Stay, it was a command, not a suggestion. Aaliyah's first instinct was to bolt. This was insane. She was in a stranger's home, a man who knew her name and had plucked her off the street like a stray. Her scrubs and coat were nowhere to be seen, likely disposed of. He had replaced her identity with these soft, anonymous clothes. And yet, where would she go? Back to her tiny, drafty apartment with its broken heater and mostly empty cupboards? Back to the relentless cycle of shifts that left her too tired to think, too poor to live? The thought of stepping back out into that biting cold was physically painful. She poured a cup of coffee, the warmth of the mug seeping into her hands. As she sipped it, she allowed herself to wander the perimeter of the vast living space. It was a place of deep contradictions, immensely luxurious, yet devoid of personal warmth. There were no photographs on the walls, no stacks of books, no sentimental trinkets. It was the home of a man who didn't want to be known. Then she saw it. She turned back to the window, watching the snow fall on the city below. For now, she would obey the note. She would stay, not out of fear, but out of a weary, pragmatic curiosity. She had to understand why. He returned late that night, moving with the same quiet efficiency as before. He found her curled on the oversized sofa, a thick blanket pulled up to her chin, watching the endless dance of the snowflakes outside the window. She had spent the day in a state of suspended animation, napping on and off, exploring the few rooms she dared to enter, and trying to quiet the frantic voice in her head that was demanding answers. When he entered, the spell of silence was broken. He didn't seem surprised to see her there. He simply placed a briefcase on the desk, removed his coat, and loosened his tie. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy with unspoken questions, a palpable tension that filled the space between them. Aaliyah felt a strange compulsion to fill it, to normalize the situation. It was the caregiver in her, the part that smoothed over discomfort and sought to put others at ease. "I can make some tea," she offered, her voice sounding small in the large room. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time that evening. His gaze was analytical, as if he were cataloging the way the soft lamplight caught the lines of her face. "That isn't necessary," he said, his voice flat. He walked into the kitchen and began preparing the tea himself, his movements precise. Frustrated by her own passivity and by his infuriatingly calm control, Aaliyah stood up. She felt an urgent need to contribute, to repay the strange debt she was accumulating with every passing hour. She began clearing the few dishes she'd used during the day, carrying them to the sink. As she reached for a glass, he was suddenly there, his hand gently but firmly closing over hers, stopping her. His touch was warm, a stark contrast to the cold that had defined her life for so long. "I told you," he said, his voice softer now. "That is not necessary." His eyes dropped to her hand, still held within his. He frowned. He had noticed the small, angry red cut on her palm, a souvenir from a broken glass at the diner 2 days ago. It was inflamed and clearly painful. Before she could protest, he released her and turned, retrieving a small, professional-looking first aid kit from a drawer. He gestured for her to sit at the kitchen island. Aaliyah hesitated. It was a bizarre role reversal. She was the nurse, the one who tended to wounds. To be the patient felt vulnerable, unsettling. But she sat, watching as he opened the kit. His large, capable hands were surprisingly gentle as he cleaned the cut with an antiseptic wipe, his touch careful and deliberate. He worked in complete silence, his focus absolute. There was an unexpected intimacy in the act, in his quiet, meticulous care. He wasn't just fixing a wound. He was tending to her, seeing a small piece of the damage her life had inflicted and methodically erasing it. He applied a small amount of ointment and then covered the cut with a bandage, his fingers brushing against hers. For a brief second, his gaze lifted and met hers across the small space. In his dark eyes, she saw not pity, but a flicker of something else, a deep, resonant stillness that looked almost like recognition. The moment passed as quickly as it came. He packed away the kit, the space between them once again filled with a careful distance. But something had shifted. The air was charged with a new awareness. He had touched her, and in that simple, clinical act, a fragile connection had been forged in the silent, empty fortress of his home. Days bled into one another, forming a strange and quiet routine. Aaliyah would wake to the silent offering of breakfast. Kenji would be gone. She would spend her days reading from the small collection of books she found on a shelf, classic literature in English, surprisingly, or simply watching the city from her perch in the sky. He would return late, and they would exist in the same space, sharing silent meals he prepared with an understated expertise. He never asked about her life, her family, her dreams. He never explained his own. The face-down photograph on his desk remained a silent, ever-present mystery. She felt her old life, the one of constant exhaustion and gnawing anxiety, begin to fade like a bad dream. The perpetual weariness in her bones was replaced by a restful calm. The calluses on her hands began to soften. She was living in a gilded cage, but the cage was warm and safe, and for the first time she could remember, she wasn't afraid of what tomorrow would bring. One evening, a fierce blizzard swept through the city, rattling the immense windows of the penthouse. The wind howled with a mournful, human-like sound, and the snow fell so thickly it obscured the view completely, encasing them in a world of swirling white. Kenji seemed different that night. He was more withdrawn than usual, his silence heavier, colder. He stood by the window for over an hour, staring out into the white abyss, a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand. Aaliyah watched him from the sofa, a knot of concern tightening in her chest. His stillness was not calm. It was rigid with a tension that seemed to emanate from him in waves. His gaze kept flicking to the desk, to the silver frame that lay on its face. Finally, she couldn't bear the oppressive silence any longer. She gathered every ounce of her courage and walked over to him, her footsteps swallowed by the plush rug. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. He didn't turn. "It was a night like this," he said, his voice low and rough, stripped of its usual control. The words hung in the air, a confession she hadn't asked for but knew was profoundly important. She waited. After a long moment, he finally turned to face her. The mask of calm indifference was gone. In its place was a raw, unguarded grief that stunned her. "I had a sister," he began, his voice strained. "Her name was Hannah. She was younger than me, headstrong, brilliant. She wanted to be a doctor." He gestured toward the desk. "That photograph is of her." He walked over to the desk, but still didn't touch the frame. "Years ago, on a night like this, with the snow so heavy you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face, she was walking home from the university library. There was a territory dispute. Senseless violence between two rival factions that had nothing to do with her. She was just in the wrong place at the wrong time." He paused, swallowing hard. "I was supposed to pick her up. I was late. 10 minutes. By the time I got there," he trailed off, the unfinished sentence more powerful than any explanation. "I found her in the snow. I was too late to help her." He finally looked at Aaliyah, his eyes dark with a pain so deep it seemed bottomless. "That night, at the bus stop, when I saw you, so cold, so alone, wearing those green scrubs. You looked like a ghost of what she might have become. I couldn't save her," he finished, his voice breaking on the last word. "But I could save you." The confession landed with the force of a physical blow. It was all there, the reason for his fixation, the source of his quiet intensity, the motivation behind this strange, protective custody. She wasn't a woman he desired. She was a penance. She was an echo of his greatest failure, an opportunity to atone for a sin that had haunted him for years. The kindness, the safety, the warmth, it wasn't for her, not really. It was for the memory of his sister, Hannah. The revelation changed the very air in the apartment. The quiet comfort she had started to feel was now tainted by the knowledge that she was a surrogate for a ghost. Every act of kindness from Kenji, every silent meal, every moment of perceived safety was recontextualized. He wasn't seeing her, Aaliyah, the resilient woman who worked 2 jobs to chase a dream. He was seeing Hannah, the sister he had lost, and he was using her to quiet the demons of his past. A profound sadness settled over her, followed by a fierce, protective anger, not at him, but for herself. She had survived on her own for so long, fueled by pride and a stubborn refusal to be anyone's burden. Now, she had become a project, a living memorial to his grief. The gilded cage suddenly felt suffocating. The luxurious softness of the clothes felt like a costume. A few days after his confession, she knew she couldn't stay. She waited for him to come home, her heart a heavy, anxious drum against her ribs. She had folded the cashmere sweater and pants he'd given her and placed them neatly on the bed in the guest room. She was wearing her own clothes again, the green scrubs and thin coat she had arrived in, which she'd found washed and pressed in the back of the closet. When he walked in, he saw her standing by the door and stopped, his usual composure faltering for a fraction of a second. He knew immediately. "I have to go," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Thank you for everything. For your kindness. But I can't stay here." He didn't ask why. He already knew. He just watched her, his expression a mask of controlled stillness, but she could see the turmoil in his eyes. "It's not safe for you out there," he stated, his voice low. It was the wrong thing to say. "My life has never been safe, Kenji," she retorted, a sharp edge to her tone. "It's been hard, and it's been cold, and it's been exhausting. But it's been mine. Here. I'm not me. I'm a stand-in for your sister. I'm a way for you to feel better about something you can't change." The accusation hung between them, stark and true. She saw a flicker of pain in his face, a raw vulnerability that mirrored the night of his confession. "I can't live like that," she continued, her voice softening slightly. "I'm not her. I can't fix your past by living in your present. It isn't fair to me, and it isn't fair to her memory." He took a step toward her, his hands clenched at his sides. He looked like he wanted to say something, to argue, to command her to stay as he had on that first night. But the words wouldn't come. He didn't know how to ask her to stay for herself, because he hadn't yet admitted to himself that his feelings had evolved beyond simple atonement. He had become so used to acting out of duty and guilt that he no longer recognized the language of genuine affection. His silence was her answer. With a final, sad look, Aaliyah turned and opened the door. The sound of it clicking shut behind her was deafeningly final. She walked down the long, empty hallway to the elevator, not looking back, stepping out of the warm, silent penthouse and back into the cold, loud reality of her own life. Life after Kenji's penthouse was a brutal return to form. The cold that seeped through the window frames of her tiny apartment felt more personal now, a constant reminder of the profound, effortless warmth she had left behind. The exhaustion from her double shift settled back into her bones, heavier than before, because she now knew what it felt like to be truly rested. Every ache, every hunger pang, every moment of anxiety was amplified by the memory of a life without them. At the hospital, the controlled chaos and the scent of antiseptic felt familiar, but her focus was fractured. She would catch herself staring out a window at the falling snow, her mind drifting back to a silent apartment with a panoramic view of the city. Her colleagues noticed the change. She was quieter, her usual resilience spark dimmed. At the diner, the work was a grueling, physical distraction. The smell of grease and burnt coffee clung to her hair and clothes. She moved through the dinner rush on autopilot, her smile for the customers a thin, brittle thing. Sometimes, a sleek black car would pass on the street outside, and her heart would leap into her throat, a foolish, painful jolt of hope and fear. She missed the silence. She had never realized how noisy her own life was. The rattling pipes in her apartment, the shouting neighbors, the constant traffic, until she had experienced the deep, profound stillness of his home. More than that, she missed him. She missed his quiet presence, the way he moved with such deliberate grace, the unexpected gentleness in his hands when he had bandaged her cut. She missed the feeling of being seen, even if she knew he was looking at her through the lens of his own grief. Meanwhile, in the penthouse, the silence that had once been Kenji's refuge had become an oppressive, suffocating void. The space felt enormous, empty. Her absence was a physical presence, a ghost far more real than the one he had been chasing. He would find himself looking toward the sofa, expecting to see her curled there under a blanket. He would make 2 cups of tea in the evening out of habit, only to stare at the second cup as it grew cold on the counter. The face-down photograph on his desk felt less like a memorial and more like an accusation. He had been given a second chance, not to save his sister, but to connect with someone who was alive, vibrant, and real, and he had let her walk away because he didn't have the words to make her stay. His men gave him discreet reports. Aaliyah had picked up more shifts. She was behind on her rent. She was selling her plasma twice a week to make ends meet. Every piece of information was a knife twisting in his gut. He had all the power and resources in the world. He could crush his enemies, build empires, command loyalty and fear. But he couldn't protect the one person who mattered from the simple, grinding hardships of poverty, because she had refused to be protected. He had offered her a cage, however comfortable, when what she needed was a partner. The realization was a slow, painful dawn. His obsession had started as penance for Hannah, but it had transformed into something else entirely. It had become about Aaliyah. 1 year. A full circle of seasons had passed. Winter had returned to Tokyo, dusting the city in a familiar blanket of white. Aaliyah was working a late shift at the diner. The year had been a relentless grind, but she had survived. She had found a slightly better apartment, enrolled in an advanced certification course for her nursing career, and had even started to save a tiny, almost laughable amount of money. She was proud of her resilience, but a quiet, persistent ache remained in her heart, a space that had been carved out by a quiet man and his silent, luxurious world. She was wiping down the last of the vinyl booths, the movements rote and automatic, her mind a million miles away. The scent of stale coffee and fried onions was so ingrained in her senses, she barely noticed it anymore. The bell above the door chimed, announcing a late customer. "Sorry, we're closing up," she said without turning around, her voice tired. I know, the voice was low and familiar. It struck her with the force of an electric shock. Aaliyah froze, the damp rag still in her hand. Slowly she turned. Kenji stood just inside the doorway, snowflakes melting on the shoulders of a simple dark wool coat. He wasn't flanked by bodyguards or dressed in an imposing suit. He just looked like a man, his face thinner than she remembered, his eyes holding a deep, weary vulnerability she had never seen before. He looked tired. He looked lost. The diner was empty except for them, the quiet hum of the coolers filling the silence. He took a few steps toward her, his gaze locked on hers. He stopped at the booth she had just been cleaning. He took in her appearance, the familiar green scrubs visible under her thin waitress apron, the exhaustion etched around her eyes. It was a painful echo of that first night, yet everything was different. The power dynamic had vanished, replaced by a raw, uncertain tension. "Aaliyah," he said, his voice husky. She found her voice, though it was little more than a whisper. "What are you doing here, Kenji?" He didn't answer immediately. His eyes searched her face, as if looking for something he was afraid he wouldn't find. He had replayed this moment in his mind 1,000 times, and in every version, he had failed to find the right words. So he fell back on the only ones that had ever connected them, infusing them with a new, desperate meaning. He looked at her, his heart in his eyes, and the command from a year ago became a question, a plea, a prayer. "You're coming with me," he said, his voice soft but clear. And then he added the one word that changed everything, the word he had known how to say a year ago. Please, the single word was an admission of need, a surrender of control. It was everything she had needed to hear. The pride and the pain of the last year began to melt away, replaced by a tentative, fragile hope. He didn't take her back to the cold, imposing penthouse that had served as her gilded cage. Instead, he drove them away from the city's glittering center toward a quiet, traditional neighborhood where the snow lay undisturbed on the tiled roofs of old houses. He pulled up to a modest wooden gate and led her down a stone path to a small, elegant house built around a central garden. Snow collected on the branches of a dormant cherry tree and on the shoulders of stone lanterns. It was peaceful, unassuming, and felt more like a home than the penthouse ever had. "This is mine," he said, his voice quiet in the still night air. "Not the organization's. Not my father's. Just mine inside." The house was warm and inviting. Polished wood floors were softened by woven rugs, and the walls were lined with books. It was a space meant for living, not for display. On a simple wooden desk near a shoji screen, she saw the silver photograph frame. This time, it was standing upright. Aaliyah walked over to it. The photo showed a young woman with a bright, intelligent smile and eyes that held the same intensity as Kenji's. Hannah. She looked happy, vibrant, and full of life. Seeing her felt like meeting a part of Kenji he had kept locked away. He came to stand beside her, his gaze on his sister's face. I spent the last year doing what I should have done a long time ago, he began, his voice laced with a difficult, hard-won honesty. I started seeing a therapist. Talking about her. About my father's expectations. About the guilt I carried. He finally turned to look at Aaliyah, his expression open and raw. I brought you to my home that first night because you reminded me of my greatest failure. I saw a chance to fix the past, and I was selfish. I didn't see you, not really, he took a deep breath. But then I did. I saw your strength, your pride, your kindness. I fell in love with a woman who worked 2 jobs without complaint, who was gentle with a stranger's wound, who had the courage to walk away from a comfortable prison because her spirit was worth more. I fell in love with you, Aaliyah. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden. He reached out, not to restrain her, but to gently cup her face, his thumbs stroking her cheek. When you left, the silence in that apartment became unbearable. I realized I wasn't trying to protect a ghost anymore. I was just a man who had lost the only person who made him feel alive. I don't want to offer you a cage. I want to build a life with you. I want to share this home with you. If you'll have me, his confession was a dismantling of every wall he had ever built. He wasn't the powerful, untouchable figure from the bus stop. He was a man, flawed and grieving, offering her his whole, vulnerable heart. The ache she had carried for a year finally dissolved, replaced by a wave of profound, overwhelming love. Yes, she whispered, the tears finally spilling over. Yes, Kenji, he closed his eyes in relief, a shudder passing through him. Then he leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that was not about possession or control, but about a deep and tender homecoming. It was a promise of a shared future, built not on guilt, but on a love that had found its way through the longest winter. 6 months later, the garden was in full bloom. The cherry tree that had been stark and barren under the winter snow was now a riot of pale pink blossoms, their petals drifting like fragrant confetti on the warm spring breeze. A small, intimate wedding ceremony was taking place on the engawa, the wooden veranda overlooking the garden. Aaliyah wore a simple, elegant ivory dress that skimmed her ankles, her hair adorned with a single white orchid. She looked radiant, her face glowing with a serene happiness that seemed to emanate from her very core. Kenji stood beside her, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark gray suit. The formidable, guarded aura he once carried was gone, replaced by a soft, focused adoration that was directed solely at his bride. His hand was linked with hers, a steady, comforting presence. They had only one guest to bear witness to their union. It was not a powerful business associate or a fearsome member of his organization. It was Mr. Tanaka, an elderly man with kind, crinkling eyes, whom Aaliyah had cared for at the hospital during a bout of pneumonia months before she ever met Kenji. She had shown him extraordinary compassion, staying after her shifts to read to him and listen to his stories. He had never forgotten her kindness. When Aaliyah had asked him to be their witness, he had accepted with tears in his eyes. His presence was a quiet validation of the goodness within her, the very quality that had first pierced through Kenji's armor. The officiant spoke in quiet, measured tones, but Aaliyah and Kenji only had eyes for each other. When it was time for their vows, Kenji's voice was clear and steady, stripped of all artifice. Aaliyah, he began, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. You came into my life like a storm, but you brought me peace. You taught me that true strength is not about control, but about vulnerability. I promise to share not just my home and my name, but my fears, my history, and my heart. I promise to be your partner, your friend, and your sanctuary. I will spend the rest of my life being the man you deserve. When it was her turn, Aaliyah's voice was thick with emotion, but her gaze was unwavering. Kenji, you found me when I was lost in the cold, but you did more than make me warm. You made me feel safe enough to be seen. You showed me that accepting help is not a weakness, and that love is not a debt. I promise to be your partner in healing, to fill this home with laughter, and to love you not for the protection you offer, but for the man you are. As they exchanged simple gold bands, a gentle breeze swept through the garden, carrying a shower of cherry blossoms over them. Mr. Tanaka clapped softly, his face alight with joy. It was not the grand wedding one might expect for a man of Kenji's stature, but it was perfect. It was real. It was a quiet, profound celebration of two lonely souls who had found each other in a storm and had learned to build a new life together in the warmth of the sun. Hand in hand, they turned to face their little garden, a shared world of their own making, ready to begin.